So apparently Trump just says stuff, or he just likes to sign stuff. That's coming from our previous conversation with a former JCPOA negotiator, Alanera. But Trump also has ideas, not very good ideas, but he has ideas. And that's something that my guest this time, Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, said to me, I think the last time about a week ago, Trita, you said, so Trump just says stuff and he just has ideas. And neither seem to be going very well for him right now because Iran has its own idea. That's the title that I called our conversation today, which is simply Trump wants an off-ramp. He's been wanting an off-ramp for ages at this point. But as you and myself and a lot of other people seem to agree, like Iran is now just keeping him, they're keeping him stuck in this perpetual spiral now. But how long can this go on for? Is where I'd start.
Let's first deconstruct some of the other things that you said. Yes, I do think he wants an off-ramp, but I think his idea of an off-ramp is still one that makes him look like the winner. And the relations have now deteriorated to the point in which it appears to me that Iranians have made the humiliation of Trump a very high priority compared to what it was earlier on. So I don't think they're in the mood of giving him an off-ramp that allows him to save face, allows him to claim some sort of a victory. And they've seen how he has tried to do it. He has tried to make it look as if he's in complete control of the situation. His insistence that we control the strait, all of these different things that are done to humiliate the other side, to give the impression that the Iranians had to succumb to American demands. And now essentially they're doing the same to him. It's getting both sides struck. Trump's desire to get out of this is not strong enough to accept an exit that is even neutral at this point. He still seems to want to insist of having the ability of claiming victory and even to a certain extent humiliate the other side. This can go on for some time, but I think it's important to understand the Iranians are also hurting by this blockade and by the closing of the strait. They too have difficulty getting things out and getting things in. Now, they have created all kinds of workarounds. They did so already during the war and in the period prior to the war. But nevertheless, it does not mean that this can go on forever. But I don't think forever is the objective here. I think at a minimum, it seems to me that they're looking to continue this till the midterm, or at least slightly before the midterm, because they want to see this really inflict the cost on him in the elections. That's not to say that the elections per se matter that much to the Iranians, but I think it is one of these milestones, or one of these points that will be reached at some point, and as a result, it's gained some degree of importance on the Iranian side. I think it's also very important to understand, even if they were to come to an agreement on how to deal with the strait, it does not mean that the other issues are resolved. I think at that point, the crisis will move from the strait to Lebanon. And Lebanon has to be resolved before they even get to the nuclear issue. So this idea that existed early on, the optimism that I shared earlier on, that perhaps the MOU 60-day plus perhaps another 60 days, I think at this point seems extremely unlikely. This is going to take much, much longer, if it even is resolvable. And of course, you do have voices on the Iranian side that are saying that there shouldn't be a deal with the US at all, not under Trump. They should drag this situation out. There should be some sort of a new normal. The strait might open, but some sort of a new normal. And then if there is a deal with the US, it would be with the next president. I think that would be a miscalculation for a variety of reasons. I think they're overestimating the desire that the next president will have in even striking a deal with Iran. Most American presidents have had absolutely no such attraction to that idea. And they've only done so more or less out of necessity, not because they wanted to. And for the Iranians to think that the next president would want to do it, that the next president would have the maneuverability to lift sanctions, that the next president would be willing to make this a priority in his first term. Those are all huge question marks that I think they're making perhaps too strong of an assumption about.
Yeah, but in all of this, it just seems to me that Trump, well, you wrote even something on your Substack, which we're streaming to as well, which was that every time Trump has nowhere to go, he's threatening. He does the opposite of what's actually the situation. So how long can this go on for? I know it's sort of what I just asked you, but like, can we really not see the United States handing over some kind of significant concession? You know, I use the comparative analysis of Putin and Ukraine, for example, which is simply, in some people's eyes, the speculative eyes, is that by getting Luhansk and Donetsk, at least the two primary oblasts, Putin is able to then come to the Russian public and say, hey, look, the SMO has gone relatively well. We have helped liberate the Russian people. Don't ignore what's happening in Kherson and Zaporizhia awkwardly, but the two main oblasts that was going back to 2014 is now means that we can begin to draw down or reduce the no need for mobilization, which Putin doesn't want to do, but might have to. So by comparison, what is Trump's equivalent to the oblast? What does he do? What can he get that he thinks then he can at least persuade his MAGA base that's enough of a sell to?
I still think that there is a pathway for him to one of those outcomes that actually would work very well for him, would work very well for his base. I'm just not as convinced as I was earlier on that he has enough control over his own administration, that he has enough ability to say no to certain donors, and that he has the patience and discipline to get to this point. But I do think there is a pathway for him in which he would get a deal and he would make it a win for him and for his base, because as part of the deal, there would be sanctions relief. He would get things from the Iranians on the nuclear front. The Strait would be open. Of course, the Strait was open before as well. But the things that he can point to beyond the nuclear concessions is that he actually manages to get American companies to enter into the Iranian market and resume trade, which would have a strong impact on the industrial base in the United States. It would create jobs. You know, Iran has the potential of becoming a top 20 trading partner of the United States. We ran an econometric model looking at this earlier on. It has a lot of different things, huge compatibility with the American economy. None of that will happen fast, of course, but it would be an opening that he can point to as a direct economic benefit to people in his base. And I think an earlier version of Trump would have more quickly gone in this direction. The more this conflict festers, the more it becomes emotionally difficult for the two sides to really get out of, the more difficult it is for either side to find a pathway to that scenario in which there is a deal, there is sanctions relief, and he touts the sanctions relief not as a concession, but as a win, because it actually benefits the American economy. That pathway did exist. I think it was a huge mistake for them not to invest in it further. And I worry that as this just drags out, they're just so angry at each other, it becomes more and more difficult to get to that point. And as a result, there are no victory paths for Trump any longer. Whatever happens is some variation of a defeat. Whereas I don't think it needed to be that case. And I think had it not been for this last round of war, the pathway to that win-win was still there.
Yeah, I think it's sort of knowing him, knowing Washington as a state or whatever, as a city, he would try to frame it from a sort of he's giving them a gift. He's being generous. He'll try to frame it like that. I'm skeptical of sanctions relief, though. Alan was arguing more about the idea of unfreezing some of those assets, but you think it would be potentially more sanctions because that's a systemic benefit for the United States. In broad.
Look, I don't think the Iranians are going to give anything on nuclear front unless there is sanctions relief. They're not going to give it just to get their assets back, because it's very easy for the U.S. to refreeze these assets. They can get all kinds of irreversible nuclear concessions from Iran, release the assets, and then 6 months later just freeze all of Iran's assets in foreign banks again. So I think what they will want is sanctions relief. And here is where I may differ. I mean, Alan is a legend, but I think I may differ with him a little bit. Looking at the structure of American sanctions on Iran, it's very different from what it is on Cuba. The Cuba sanctions start off with an embargo that is passed through Congress. Whatever is passed through Congress can only be lifted by Congress. The executive branch cannot lift congressional sanctions. Now, congressional sanctions may provide with waiver capabilities for the president. So he can waive the sanctions for 90 days, for 180 days. That's what Obama did as part of the JCPOA. But in the Iranian case, the primary sanctions, the sanctions that prevent American companies from going into Iran, are overwhelmingly executive orders and designations done by the executive branch. The president can do this without any interference by Congress, without any approval by Congress. The congressional sanctions tend to be secondary sanctions, the sanctions that the US impose on European, Russian, Chinese, Indian companies if they trade or invest in Iran. And yes, those may be very difficult to lift, but one important data point, Trump did lift those sanctions on Syria, the Caesar Act, which was an extremely unusual move. I frankly don't recall seeing a major sanctions piece of legislation being actively lifted in Congress. Keep one other thing in mind. 25 years ago, we were still in a world in which whenever the US imposed sanctions through Congress, they had like a 5-year sunset. And every 5 or so years, they needed to be reenacted. After 9/11, that changed. Yeah. Congress started to just impose sanctions indefinitely. And in order to get rid of them, you actually had to have an active move by Congress to lift them. And the only time I know of that happened is with the Caesar Act under Trump on Syria. But nevertheless, let's say that he doesn't lift the secondary sanctions. A lot of these secondary sanctions will become hollow if the primary sanctions are lifted. Some of them are based on sanctioning entities that have been designated by the US Treasury. So if the US Treasury lifts those designations, the secondary sanctions, the congressional sanctions become hollow and empty. Moreover, if the United States itself is investing in Iran or trading with Iran, it's going to be increasingly difficult to expect countries like China, India, and others who still have a degree of independence from the United States, unlike Europe, to abide by those secondary American sanctions, saying, well, hold on, if you're trading with that country, we're going to trade with them as well, and we don't care about your congressional sanctions. So I think the secondary sanctions, I'm not saying they're going to go away, I'm just going to say they're going to lose a tremendous amount of their punch if the primary sanctions are lifted, and the primary sanctions can be lifted by the president through executive orders, at least most of them can. So his ability to do this, I think, is stronger than most people give him credit for. Doesn't mean that he will, of course. I'm just saying that the pathway does exist. And this is also something I think the Iranians may have miscalculated or misunderstood. There's been this deep skepticism if can Trump really deliver on sanctions relief, thinking that everything has to go through Congress. And I don't think he has.
So in the time that I'm sort of getting my point together, Trita, I'm just sending you in the private chat because unfortunately it's not streaming to yours, but I've just put in the chat the note to our conversation if you just want to restack it for some of your audience.
I just did.
Good. But just on this point, because of my time working in the UN, I was always fascinated by one of the things I wrote about for a piece of my thesis was economic statecraft and sanctions. And the UN sanction system is quite fascinating to me because of how complex it is. And the reason I'm raising this is because you've always had this snapback mechanism, which was never fully utilized, I think, since the late 2000s. And I remember an article from a couple of years ago when I was speaking to someone called Jason Brodsky, who I'm sure you're familiar with. He's more hawkish, perhaps. But
perhaps.
But he was talking to me about snapback sanctions or the snapback mechanism for UN sanctions. So where do they lie in all of this? If we're talking primarily about US unilateral sanctions, where do multilateral sanctions sit in this?
So you have different sets. On the one hand, you have the European sanctions, and that goes through the European system, and they have their own criteria, etc. They are, at the end of the day, things that will. There's some things that make it easier, some things that make it harder. They don't have to take into account their own legislators. which is very important. So they don't have a Congress in the same way that can override them. It goes through the executive branch. On the other hand, my understanding is that it has to be done through consensus, which means that one single country's foreign ministry opposing it could create a problem, and as a result, those sanctions don't get lifted. On the other hand, conversations I had with folks in the European system said that in general, though, for them to be able to process the whole thing was extremely fast compared to the American system. It could actually be done, if I remember correctly, between 6 and 13 days to process the whole thing. But again, if it requires consensus, then it's a different story. The multilateral sanctions, meaning the ones that are going through the UN, at the end of the day, goes through the UN Security Council. If the United States itself puts forward a resolution in the Council that calls for or that lifts all existing UN sanctions, that resolution will pass unless one of the other 4P5 put in a veto, and Russia and China would not do so. The French have threatened that they would do so if they find Trump's nuclear deal to be unsatisfactory. But I would take that with a grain of salt. The French have not imposed a veto in the Council since 1986 or 88, if I'm not mistaken. It is a very critical part of their foreign policy at this point to not exercise the veto. I think it's partly because both the French and the Brits recognize that given the distribution of power in the system today, they hardly even qualify for a permanent seat in the Council, let alone a veto. If they use the veto, it undermines their standing in the Council and could bring about the situation. Not that they would be kicked out, but it would create problems for them. So I find it very unlikely that the French would. But I think this is a strategy for the French to inject themselves into the conversation. And I think they have their own reasons to do so, including a traditional position on nuclear proliferation, at least in the last 20, 30 years, that tends to be quite hawkish. But anyways, the most likely scenario is that the US puts forward a resolution and it passes and all of those UN sanctions are lifted. Keep in mind, there wasn't strong pressure from the UN system or for the membership of the UN for these sanctions. This was driven by the United States and secondarily by European states and of course Israel. But a lot of countries were very unhappy because the faith in sanctions is very, very limited.
Yeah,
and a lot of Europeans, by the way, a lot of Europeans outside of the E3 are very unhappy of how the E3 handled the Iran file, particularly the invocation of the snapback, which they did in late 2025. It certainly did not give Europe any more leverage. It certainly did help move matters towards this disastrous war, not to say that it's responsible for it, but it added to the context. And it has made Europe essentially lose its last card in these negotiations. And as you have seen, both the war and the diplomacy, Europe is nowhere to be found.
I don't know. I think you should give a little bit more agency to the Europeans, if I'm honest. But certainly...
Agency or leverage? Tell me which one.
Why does it matter?
Well, because, agency in terms of them taking initiatives, etc., is one thing. In terms of them actually having an impact is a different thing.
Well, you could say...
I don't know if they've had either, frankly.
Well, the United States attempted to have an impact in this war, and they have had anything but.
Sure. No, but they're still in the war. But so, for instance, you have the French-British initiative to open up the Strait. It's an initiative, it's an agency, it's had zero impact. Not to say that it won't down the road.
No, as I say, the Lebanese economy would have collapsed if it wasn't for French aid. I think that's quite clear. The Brits are particularly useless over Cyprus, but I don't think a continent's unwillingness to get involved in a war of choice by an orangutan is a weakness. I think it's a smart strategic.
No. Let me be absolutely clear. I was not
And also Europeans.
bemoaning that the Europeans are not in this. For the love of God, don't get me wrong on that one. And on that, I agree with you. Was actually to a certain extent. Well, there's nuances here at the end of the day. Yes, the Brits declined allowing the US to use Diego Garcia, whatever the base is. And it really ticked off Trump. And I think it was ultimately the right decision not to get involved in that war. The German chancellor was sitting right next to Trump, endorsing the war. 2 days after the war in the Oval Office, as you recall. And the Germans allowed their bases in Germany to be extensively used logistically for this war. It's not a direct involvement in the war, but if we use the European metric, if the Russians were using a lot of Iranian bases for their attack on Ukraine, which they haven't, although the Iranians have given support in other ways, Europe would definitely view that as an Iranian involvement in the war. I think there's some differences between these states, and I think the German performance in particular has been quite shameful for Europe, and particularly for Germany's own history. I mean, I remember very fondly the Germany that didn't succeed, but that had the courage and the integrity to firmly stand against the illegal invasion of Iraq, and doing so for the right reasons and be proven right. That Germany doesn't exist any longer.
Well, I mean, Helmut Marko is Philip Merckx is not Helmut Marko, but the same as what's his face? I see he's so unrememberable. I can't even remember his name. Keir Starmer is no Margaret Thatcher. Not that I'm everything about Margaret Thatcher was correct, but certainly, I mean, to answer your question more simply, Trita, I think that the Europeans are undergoing a little bit of strategic patience here. I think that they recognize collectively, and we have to also remember that there is not unanimity amongst the nation states. Just look at what happened in northern Spain, right? But what I do think Europe as a collective is doing is considering its situation right now. I think it has agency, but I think it's waiting when it does have the potential for more leverage, because right now the Europeans are wholeheartedly dependent on the United States for its security umbrella and everything. And to decouple or significantly de-risk from the United States in the transatlantic relationship, that requires time. The re-engineering, industrialization and militarization of Germany, of various nations, is going to take time. So I think if you were to ask me that question in 10 years from now, hoping that we're not in the same situation, things are slightly better, I would be more, I'd like to be more bullish on Europe, but don't get me wrong, I'm not being too, I'm not being rose tinted here. I'm not trying to be sort of idealistic, naivety youngster, but I do like to believe that Europe has the capacity, the human capital to do stuff.
I certainly agree with that. And I think 10 years from now, we may be in a very different situation. The reason why I'm a little bit less bullish on that, or a little bit more skeptical or concerned about whether Europe will have the backbone and integrity to do this, not that they don't have the capacity, is because the clock didn't start ticking, 6 months ago. It started ticking more than 10, 15 years ago, in which it was very, very clear that Europe needed to make sure that it had a degree of independence, not because it would turn against the United States, rather that in order to make sure that this would be a strong partnership, there needed to be enough maneuverability for Europe to be able to stand on its own legs. And it consistently chose not to take this seriously. And even though there were clear demands, some of them questionable from the American side, that Europe was free riding on American security, was not standing up enough for its own security, etc. There was a lot of nodding, etc., but none of that was taken seriously by Europe. And then Trump came, and that was the big test. And they got a taste of how the future could be. And instead of taking that seriously, they treated Trump as if he was an aberration. And once Biden came in, they treated Biden as if this was a return to normalcy, completely being oblivious to deeper trends in American society and a divergence of interest that necessitated, regardless of who is in charge in Washington, that the Europeans got serious about a degree of autonomy. Now, if they don't do it after this, then I don't know if they ever will. But my point is, this is not the first time a major wake-up call was given to the Europeans in which they
I
had
would go further, though. I would say that Brexit was the demonstration. I know I want to take back, I've got an interesting segue after this, whatever, pivot back. But, Brexit could be argued as the demonstration that that made Europe, the European Union, stronger than ever, right? Italy, Grexit, all these other things never came to fruition because Europeans looked like, holy shit. Well, screw that. The Brits want to be lonely old little England on their island. You happy guys with the EU's actually not that bad. The average support, if you look at a barometer from this year, 74% of Europeans support the EU in some way or another. So even without Trump, what aggravates me about Europe is we had Brexit. And they still didn't read the writing on the wall that there are things that you need to be more independent, that you need to have your strategic autonomy, that you need to take initiative. Not investing in your defense sector for over 35 years because you're too busy free riding, enjoying your spritzes by the Mediterranean coastline. Lovely. I love doing that daily. But you need to take, pull your finger out your ass, as my father says, excuse me, Russian saying, and do something about it. It should never have got to this stage in the first place. And so certainly I agree with you. But what's interesting, Trita, just to pivot, is as we've seen Europe not get itself together, we have seen this Mecca agreement signed. Now, I'm very interested to know from you. I did a video on it a few days ago, which is very popular on YouTube. And I wrote an article on Substack about it, which people can read if they want. What does that mean for Iran's calculus? For Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan does it mean anything, or it's a nothing burger?
I'll make a couple of points. The first one is the obvious one, and we don't have to treat it for long, is that, look, at the end of the day, this is only happening because the confidence in the American security umbrella is now gone. And it's been going on for some time. In the Saudi experience, the failure of the US from their view to strike at Iran when the Iranians struck at the Saudi airfields in 2019, when the Biden administration did not support the UAE when the Houthis attacked them, all of that was an indication that the US's willingness to actually come into their defense was declining. And then after this war, we can see the US doesn't have the ability to protect them against attacks from Iran, and it doesn't have the willingness to protect them against attacks from Israel. So what is it good for? So that creates a vacuum that necessitates them finding other alternatives. I don't think this will be the only alternative. I think this is one potential pathway. I don't know how long, if it will be the key pathway going down the road. It all depends on how it evolves. As Fidan had made it clear, this is an open, this is not a closed alliance. There may be more countries joining. And there's differences there, of course. The Turks are very eager to get the Egyptians on board. It's not entirely clear whether the Egyptians didn't want to or if the Saudis didn't want the Egyptians to be on board. There has also been efforts by some of them to get the Iranians on board. And if the Iranians were to get on board, it would be a fundamental shift in the region as a whole. Obviously, that is not an option right now because Iran is in an active war. And these guys are not going to sign up to defend Iran as the US is attacking Iran. But second point is we have to always remember these agreements can be very, very crucial, but they only go as far as their credibility. And right now, there are important credibility questions. Will Pakistan go to war with Iran if Iran attacks Saudi Arabia again? Will it do so even now against the Houthis when there are tensions between the Houthis and the Saudis? Will Turkey go to war with Iran? I find that very, very unlikely. And we saw that there was a Saudi-Pakistan deal during this war that was announced before this war, and it didn't have any impact on Pakistan's conduct. In fact, Pakistan was mediating the conflict rather than getting involved. So I think, secondly, there is a question mark there that we have to recognize that this is an embryonic thing at this point. It could end up becoming a very strong defense pact, but it's not at a NATO level yet, even though it appears to have that ambition and it appears to use some language from NATO, which I personally find problematic. The big thing for the Iranians, in my view, is the risk that they face is if they play their cards badly and they convince these states that they are a threat to them, then you will have a scenario in which for the last 4 decades, the organizing principle of American foreign policy has been to isolate and contain Iran. And it's been driven by an American impetus, which is driven by an American desire for hegemony in the Middle East. But that will now be replaced with a regional impetus for containing and isolating Iran because of the regional perception that Iran is a threat to them. I'm not saying that's where we are right now. In fact, I think the signaling coming from the Turks and the Pakistanis in particular is that they do not want this to go in that direction. This is more aimed at filling the vacuum. It's more aimed at potentially setting off, balancing against the Israelis. But of course, it's not, the contours of this is not clear at this point. And the intention of it may not either be fully clear, but it is evolving as one option. It can evolve into something else. It can evolve into including Iran and a lot of other regional states, and then actually taking the shape of an inclusive regional security arrangement, which is where I hope things would go. Perhaps the starting point would have to be something like this. I think there should be other ways of doing this. But ultimately, that is the only pathway I see that really can bring security. If this ends up becoming just another bloc formation in the region, then I don't think it will add security in the long run. I think those type of bloc formations tend to drive insecurity in the longer run. But we don't know yet. It's not determined yet. And I think it's very embryonic.
Yeah, certainly it is. But a couple of things on this, which I think is interesting. The key point for me is that it says, Article 5, an attack on one should be considered an attack on all. Okay, well, that's not very complicated. Second, Iran is a potent military force despite what's happened in the past half a year. I mean, much more than the Saudis. So realistically, the only real force that I look at with any degree of influence is Turkey. Their military is very powerful and huge, second largest in NATO. Pakistan's an interesting one because of the nuclear element. And then this makes me begin to wonder about the I2U2. I'm sure you're familiar with that, because that kind of pulls in India and Israel, the United States, the Emiratis have put all their eggs in one basket. So can we see two conflicting blocs here which begin to compete, and it all gets a little bit hairy, let alone the Abraham?
Terribly worried about that. And it's actually very interesting. I remember that 20 years ago, I had conversations with some folks in an Iranian think tank that were looking forward and seeing what would a potential geopolitical situation in the region look like 20, 30 years forward. And one scenario they were considering, but in a negative way, worrying about, was that there would be an entrance by India, China, and other states as competitors in the Persian Gulf. Not exactly this constellation, but starting to look very similar, because you're absolutely right. If this becomes a Pakistan, Saudi, Turkey axis, and on the other side of it, you have India, UAE, Israel, which, to be frank, is there. The Emiratis are not happy about it. There's some people who are saying that the reason why the Egyptian didn't join is not because it was too negative towards Israel, but because the Emirati influence on Egypt is now too strong. And the Emiratis did not allow the Egyptians to join in. But you do have clear intelligence, security collaboration between the Indians and the Israelis, and the Emiratis, of course. And if this ends up becoming two blocs that compete over this area, then yes, it may be true. It may not be targeting Iran, but it will nevertheless create these type of bloc formations that would make the Middle East yet again an arena for geopolitical competition rather than a geopolitically neutralized space, which I think an inclusive security architecture has a much better chance of achieving.
But then what does this do for, one, the United States, but also the balance of power? This podcast is primarily about grand strategy and great power competition, right? We look at the big picture and how the systemic shifts occur and influence individual nation states and vice versa. So what does this do for the United States under the Trump administration, of what's left of it? Is there capacity for China to move in? I don't think so. They don't have the military nor political desire.
They don't have the desire at the end of the day. I mean, look what they're doing. The Chinese conclusion from this is not like the American instinct. Oh, there's insecurity in the Persian Gulf and that oil is important for global markets. Let's take control of it. That's not the Chinese reaction. The Chinese reaction is, ooh, it seems like Persian Gulf oil is becoming increasingly unstable. Let's invest massively in alternatives in order to reduce our dependency on Persian Gulf oil, rather than actually getting more involved militarily. So I think what you're going to see from the Chinese side, they're not going to give up on it entirely, but they're going to just create a lot of redundancies and a lot of capacity that goes manners in which they can get energy from other ways, including green technology and other things, to just simply reduce their dependence. They're very dependent, far more dependent than the US. The US is not dependent at all. So they're seeing this as a danger. It's the dependency that is the danger. It's not the instability. The instability is a function of something else. The reason why it becomes a problem for China is the dependency. Now, China will get to a point in which it will realize that even if it protects itself, which it did this time around, its neighbors cannot protect themselves from these energy shocks. And the economic impact that has on their neighbors has an impact on them. I mean, the Japanese, if I'm not mistaken, it's like 95% of their energy needs are coming from the Persian Gulf. They don't have the capacity to protect themselves from these massive increases in costs. So this is going to have a very negative impact on their economy, which eventually will impact China as well. So even if China can insulate itself, it cannot insulate itself from the broader energy shocks that affect everyone else negatively.
So I guess as we wrap, unfortunately, Trita, what would you say for us to watch? What are you going to be looking for or not looking for? What isn't mentioned that you think will be a big deal or will be mentioned or done by Iran in this period? I mean, we'll have you on next week. Obviously, it's like a sort of every day.
The data points I've gotten just in the last couple of hours are very negative, actually. Mm-hmm. And something I did not think was particularly likely may actually become more likely, which is that we may have a third round of military action. I don't know if it will be different. You and I talked about how shocking it is, how the second round learned nothing from the first. This is taking place simultaneously, in which the warnings about the depletion of interceptors, of munitions, of projectiles is alarmingly low. We're having now scenarios in which, for instance, the Abraham Lincoln, as I understand it, has been out in sea for 9 months, which is a record. You have suicide attempts by troops there, and this is starting to become a crisis or a scandal in the United States, in the manner in which psychologically this is impacting the troops a lot, because this is not a land war, and there is no end in sight. There is no clarity whatsoever on how long they're supposed to be there. And it's a little bit different for a scenario in which you had troops on the ground in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And I'm not saying that that was in any way, shape, or form easy, but they were, circling in and out, whereas that is not the case for the folks that are on these different carriers in the same way. So to go into a third round of these circumstances looks insane to me, but apparently going into it, the second round was also insane, and we nevertheless did that. So I am worried that we may actually go even worse before it potentially can become better.
But a third round of what? Naval blockade? We don't have the
naval blockade is already there. We were talking about a third round of massive bombing campaign, and then the Iranians will respond in kind. And depending on how far the US goes, it may go further than it did last time, but also mindful of the fact that the Iranians are increasingly talking about being more on the offensive than defensive. The Iranians may, in the third round, do much more of what they did a little bit in the second round, which is they took initiative and attacked rather than just responding.
Well, they were making preemptive moves, weren't they? I guess this is what you'd say horizontal, because in the second round they started striking more bases. Jordan was hit for the first time. Egypt was hit a couple of weeks ago for the first time. So more strikes further and further afield.
More strikes further away, but also, as you recall, some of those attacks were no longer in response to an American attack, whereas the pattern up until that point had been that the Iranians responded, and now they at least were crossing that line on one or two occasions in which they went further. And if you listen to what the Iranian security officials are increasingly talking about, is that they are now shifting from a defensive to an offensive mode.
Is that what Aragachi means by bigger miscalculation?
I don't know if that is exactly what it means, but if you listen to what some of the folks from the IRGC, et cetera, are saying, it seems like there's some important shifts taking place in how they're going to go about it if there is a third round.
Oh, God. Well, everyone, I guess we'll be back more often, including the Trita. But everyone, thanks very much for watching.
Thank you so much, Good. Appreciate it.
No, of course. Do subscribe to Trita's Substack if you haven't already. Subscribe to mine, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.